Welcome to the Wilson Center. Welcome to this History and Public Policy program / Cold War International History Project event. I'm Christian Osterman. I direct History and Public Policy program as well as European Studies here at the center. It's great to see all of you for this book launch for Liberty's Surest Guardian, American Nation Building from Washington to Obama, featuring of course, the author of the book, Jeremy Surest, and Professor John McNeil from Georgetown as a commentator. It's great to have Jeremy back, not only a longtime friend and longtime partner in the Cold War Project and all sorts of other historical conspiracies and projects, including a most recent wonderful conference on the Lofoten Islands that we both participate in. So it's wonderful to have him back. We launched his first book here, I think, at the center, and we're delighted to launch his third book.
You launched the second, too.
We launched. That's right. Well, you're. We're into launching Jeremy Surest here at the center. Apparently, he is the Mac Brown Distinguished Professor for Leadership, History, and Public Policy at the Robert Strauss Center for International Security and Law at the University of Texas, Austin. Just moved there this summer. He has a joint appointment there with the LBJ School of Public Affairs and the Department of History. Prior to that, he taught for 10 years at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, where he was the E. Gordon Fox Professor of History, directed the Center's European Union Center of Excellence. He is the author of 4 previous books on contemporary politics and foreign policy: Henry Kissinger and the American Century, The Global Revolutions of 1968, and Power and Protest, and American Foreign Relations since 1898. He is a frequent contributor to newspapers, magazines, blogs, and so forth. Too long of a list to list all of his publications here. Let me just say that he's also an award-winning teacher, receiving the class of 1955 Distinguished Teaching Award from the University of Wisconsin. And the Smithsonian Magazine recognized Jeremy as one of America's top young innovators in the arts and sciences. I'll introduce John in a moment after Jeremy, so it's a great pleasure to turn the mic over to Jeremy. Welcome back, and we look forward to Liberty's Surest Guardian.
Okay. Thank you, Christian. It's really a great joy to be here, and I want to say how much I'm thankful to the Woodrow Wilson Center, not only for launching my books, but for sponsoring, I think, some of the most important scholarship and research that's been done in the last 10 to 20 years. I think our field of international history has been transformed by the work that Christian and others have done here, in sponsoring research, in sending people to god-awful places of the world to do their research, collecting the documents, but most of all, making materials more accessible to people than they've ever been before. I've benefited from that enormously, but I see that every day with my graduate students, a few of whom are sitting in the room here, the ways in which they've been able to do the kinds of research that were unthinkable before, thanks to you, Christian, and thanks to the Woodrow Wilson Center. And it's something that we should all, as historians, be very thankful for. I also want to thank my friend John McNeil for coming and slogging through my book and giving us some wise comments, wiser than my comments, I'm sure. John is one of the historians I respect most because in many ways he's my model historian. He never writes the same book twice, and I've tried to follow that model myself. I've never understood why people want to write the same book twice, but so many people do that. John has ranged across millennia, not just across decades, as some of us have tried. So let me talk then for about 30 minutes or so about my new book. This is a book that, like every project that we as scholars work on, grows out of prior work and prior thinking. And in particular, I've been struck in some of my prior work and teaching with the ways in which the term nation building was thrown around continuously in the course of American historical thinking and in the course of international relations activities over at least the last century. if not more than that. It's a phrase like liberalism that gets used but rarely defined. What do we mean by this? What do we claim we are doing? Why do we use this term? And so I began this project trying to investigate in some ways the intellectual history of this term, but of course its connection to policy activities. And the more I got into this, the more research I did, the more thinking I did about this, the more, in fact, I became convinced that there was something deeper here. And one of my pleas in the book is for us to think about contemporary policy, not just in the context of the Cold War, which of course is important, but in the context of a long tradition of American thinking and a long tradition of international thinking about how one changes the world. And this is where I think what political scientists call path dependence is a crucial concept for us to take into account. As historians, we always say the past mattered. But path dependence means something deeper than that. It means the ways we define and look at events today are deeply conditioned by experiences that our society and other societies have had over the long term, assumptions we've made, de facto responses, routines, comfort zones we have moved into. And nation building, above all else, it seems to me, is exactly that in the American experience. And I want to say from the start, this book is not designed to valorize nation building, nor is it designed to undermine nation building. It's designed to analyze what we've done. And it strikes me that over the course of 200 years, Americans have actually thought about nation building in remarkably similar ways, that there's a great deal of continuity. A great deal of continuity in the ways Americans have perceived the world and perceived themselves and their place in it. And here, I think we have to break down the distinctions between domestic and international affairs. One of the crucial elements in the ways in which Americans have thought about nation building is from their own experience. American foreign policy has been made in the image of American domestic politics, and we're wrong in a sense to divide these two things off. The path dependence to the ways Americans think about nation building comes largely from the American experience with nation building at home. And that's why this book begins not just with the founding of the United States and the intellectual creation of a body of knowledge about nation building, but also the experience of the American Civil War, which became the foundation for the ways in which many scholars, citizens, and analysts thought about what it meant to move into a new society and change that society. This was the first cohesive and coherent experience with that Americans had. In fact, it was the largest nation-building project of the 19th century, here within our own society, within our own borders. And in fact, if you go back and read the records of the Freedmen's Bureau, as I have and as many others in this room have as well, you see it's actually often talked about in those terms. General Otis Howard himself saw himself creating a new nation in the South, not simply reforming the South, but creating a new nation. And of course he was. You had a whole population that became empowered and part of the citizen body in a way they hadn't been before. The single largest reappropriation of property and the single largest empowerment of citizens in the 19th century occurred in the American South, in fact. So much for America having no history of government intervention in its own society. That path dependence, I think, is crucial because that experience at home and the perceived success, even though many historians would say it was not successful, and in fact probably wasn't if you did a balance sheet analysis, became a foundational way for Americans thinking about the wider world as they entered into it more directly and with more intensive relations in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. And a lot of work by my predecessors, in particular at the University of Wisconsin, had looked at the economic influences of the late 19th century. And Kenton Clymer and others have written a lot about the role of figures like John Hay. But in fact, I think the experience of the Civil War, for those very same individuals, for those very same reasons, had a huge impact upon the way they perceived the world. Americans came to believe that the world would be better for themselves and for others if it was organized as a world of nation-states. This was, I argue, a self-conscious effort that we still live with today to traverse the space between empire and chaos. Americans self-consciously do not want to be an empire. You might believe we've become one, and perhaps we have. But there is no ideological foundation for Americans advocating empire, just as there is no interest foundation for Americans accepting a world of chaos. We have too many economic interests going back to just the period I've been talking about that would allow us to presume the world could go its own way and we could not care about it at all. Our economic interests, not to mention our strategic and cultural interests, would not allow that. So this effort to traverse the space between empire and chaos has been, I argue, and I'm not the only one to argue this, I think, has been the place where Americans have thought about nation building. Nation states for Americans, in this path-dependent way, looking in on ourselves, are a way of thinking about an orderly yet free world. A world that is self-governing but yet follows certain rules. A world where people will choose to make decisions for themselves but make those decisions in ways quite naturally that would serve our interests as well. This is the nation-building model Americans have, and we are in a certain way stuck in it because it's also our history of ourselves that we tell ourselves as well. The formation of states within the United States, the formation of the United States as a union itself. For all the limitations of our model of nation building at home, it is still a model that even the harshest critics of American foreign policy would generally accept as a successful model at home, or in Churchill's terms, better than anything anyone else could come up with. So as a consequence, it becomes the paradigm that Americans have continuously applied to themselves and overseas. And the path dependence in this comes from the ways in which Americans come back to this time and again when imperiled, come back to this time and again when threatened, come back to this time and again when they believe they have to do something in a place they are unprepared for. And in my book, that's the story time and again. Americans arrive in the Philippines as they arrived in the Confederacy, not knowing what to do, not knowing how to deal with the situation they're in. Same thing in Germany and Japan after World War II, same thing in Vietnam, and we've all lived through Afghanistan and Iraq in exactly those terms. There's nothing new in this story. In fact, the Civil War predicted it all. The Freedmen's Bureau is the first of these phenomenon. I love the story of the creation of the Freedmen's Bureau, so indulge me for a second. Secretary of War Stanton, finding that the Union Army was now in possession in 1864-65 of large numbers of freed slaves and in large numbers of Confederate soldiers and others, and didn't know what to do with them, created a bureau called the Freedmen's Bureau and empowered one of General Sherman's assistants, General Otis Howard, to be the director of it. And he did it exactly the way this was done with Taft in the Philippines, exactly this was the way this was done after World War II, certainly the way this was done in Afghanistan and Vietnam. He basically told Howard that he'd have no budget, but that he had to create a free society, and that he could requisition resources from the military for that. Why from the military? Because that's where the money is. That's where the resources were at the end of the Civil War. That's where the resources were when Americans arrived in the Philippines. That's where they were after World War II. We lament the absence of funding for the State Department today. That's not a new story. We lament the absence of civilian-trained personnel. That's not a new story. Time and again, that's the story in all of these cases. And it is that incapacity combined with the idealism of the moment that continually puts Americans in this place of nation building. What did the Freedmen's Bureau do that each of these other nation building cases overseas involved? The Freedmen's Bureau went in and sought to create institutions that would mimic American institutions for self-governance. Not necessarily democratic, but institutions that would empower people who were seen as capable of running the society, and individuals who would build a common identity in a defined territory with a claim to representation. We take this for granted now, that this is the way the world is organized, or Americans want to organize the world. It was not the way the world was organized in the 18th century, not even in the 19th century as such. But it is a self-conscious effort to organize the world to self-govern in ways that would match with American thinking. The immediate question, of course, is why does this often involve what seem like derivations or deviations from democracy? Because it's a different thing. And that's another point I'm making in the book. For all the rhetoric of democratization, which I think Americans believe or want to believe, the story of American activity at home and abroad has been a story of trying to build institutions and trying to empower figures who can run institutions that are seen as being able to govern themselves in orderly ways. And democracy would come later, if at all. And the allure of dictators, and it's consistent, is the allure of those who seem capable of doing this, those who seem able to provide shortcuts on this route. And time and again, we see Americans falling into that, looking to empower particular figures. Nation building is not democratization, and if my book tries to do anything, it tries to separate these concepts. Nation building is about empowering governing institutions that are modeled on our own. It is not about empowering all people or empowering democratic governance, and in fact, that's not even the story of our own society for its first half of its experience, in fact. Now, why is this so difficult? Why are the failures as great as the successes? And my book argues that we have a mix of both. In fact, my book argues that Germany is the exception in how successful it turns out in our own terms, and Vietnam is the exception in how horrible it turns out. Most end up somewhere in the middle, like the American South, like the Philippines, probably like where Iraq will be 5 to 10 years from now. This is incredibly difficult, and it produces very mixed results. For reasons that are obvious but often lost in the process, moving into a foreign society, trying to change a people is difficult enough, but trying to create a homogeneous institutional world is incredibly difficult. And the disjunction between the undersourcing and the overcommitment is a recurring phenomenon, and they are interrelated with one another. I don't think you can separate the two. The nation-building presumption is that the world should look a certain way, but that we should not have to do it as an empire would. So you have this recurring process of overcommitment and under-resourcing of that commitment. And in the book, I show how in every case, from the Civil War forward, that's the complaint on the ground. In every case, that's true. Even in Germany after World War II. Many of you have read these sources. If you look at what Lucius Clay is saying, if you look at what the American government is dealing with in 46, 47, it's under-resourced there just as it is elsewhere. And the solutions that Americans frequently come up with are not solutions that change the model, but are efforts to provide infusions of resources for a short period, what we today might call surges. There are different kinds of surges in different periods, but there's a recurring process of this as well, a recurring process of trying to send in short-term resources for long-term institutional change. My verdict on this, and I hope we can talk about some of the cases as we go on, is that the outcomes are mixed. This is not an abject failure, but nor is it a great success. And one of the problems Americans, I think, have is recognizing that political outcomes historically are much more complex than the categories we assign to them. Or to put it in other terms, much more complex than the electoral definitions we want to give to them every 4 years. To say that the United States failed in the South or in the Philippines or in Germany would be inaccurate, but to say it succeeded would be inaccurate too. Nation building is a long-term process, and it's a process Americans find themselves in time and again beyond their own expectations, beyond their own time commitments. And one of the great things in this story, I argue, is that Americans have indeed continued to do this. I'm an advocate of at least trying to change the world in positive ways. One of the horrible things is that Americans have not updated their thinking about how this really works. So the discussion I'd like us to have, maybe we don't have to have it now. We can have whatever discussion you guys want us to have. The discussion I'd like us to have as a society would be not should we nation build or not nation build, not should we fund foreign aid or not, as the New York Times was reporting on today. No, that's not the discussion we should have. The discussion we should have is what are the things we care about, what are the ways we want to see the world change, and what are the things we think we can do, and what are the commitments we are willing to make, what are the places we're willing to do this in. This history, I think, provides us with some ideas of ways we could do this. We could partner, and there's a history of effective partnership. Not just unilateralism, but partnership in each of these cases, just as there's a history of unilateralism at times. In the Philippines, William Howard Taft was remarkably successful in building partnerships with the United States with various groups, I'd argue, but he was also remarkably a failure at dealing with groups that were disenfranchised from this process. But the United States can build partnerships and probably do a better job. The United States can also create processes that outlast our own experience in a country. We can invest beyond ourselves. We can invest beyond our time. That is the story of Western Europe. Even though there are still American soldiers in Europe, Western Europe has gone on a trajectory well beyond the direct American commitment. And that's a process that the United States helped to put in place. We can invest in processes that outlive us. We can also invest in destructive processes, as we did in Chile and many parts of Latin America, thinking about the processes we're involved in. What does it mean when we enter a place like Afghanistan with a long tribal history, with a long history of various different groups with allegiances to other countries in the area? What does that mean? What kind of process are we getting ourselves into, and how should we situate ourselves in that process? Problem solving. The United States in each of these cases that I talk about solved certain problems. We have resources and we have capable people who can do things. For all the failures in the American South, for example, it was the period of Reconstruction that provided the basis for African American education. for all of the failures of the United States in Vietnam, there was actually market formation that occurred in some ways there. For all of our failures in Iraq, there are still ways in which groups have been empowered. But the United States can also be remarkably blind to the problems it creates by some of the activities that it undertakes. And being attentive to what some might call blowback, what some might call the externalities of our actions, are crucial as well. That's far too absent, it seems to me, in the historical record. Purpose, remembering why we're doing what we're doing and what we care about and what our vision is, and remembering that that's what we need to be true to. The story of Abu Ghraib, and you have similar cases, though usually not quite as bad, in the Philippines and elsewhere, is a story of forgetting our purpose, forgetting why we're doing what we're doing. It's the classic case of getting involved in a set of activities and continuing to do them to justify the fact that you did them yesterday. Being willing to understand why we're doing what we're doing and tack back and forth in our policies. One of the great successes, actually, early on in this story is the success of civilian governance over the military. Time and again, in the American South, in the Philippines, and in Germany, civilian elements of the American government stopped the military from going too far. And in fact, usually this involved someone named MacArthur, Arthur MacArthur or Douglas MacArthur. I actually have a student who's just finishing a dissertation on the U.S. and Japan in the 1950s. I'm reminded that there was a third MacArthur. They all seem to have the same problem, actually. Civilian figures being able to tack back from military decisions that made sense at one moment but didn't make sense for the broader purpose of what we were supposed to serve. That's a lesson I think we forgot in recent years, a lesson we could relearn in the way we structure decision-making in our society. And then remembering, finally, that nation building is not just about the people over there, but also the people over here. Part of the story I tried to tell in this book, and one of the real reasons I wrote this book, is because I think the nation building we've done at home and abroad has also changed us. And too often I'm frustrated with the ways we talk about nation building as if it's something we're doing there, and we're still the same. Well, we've had some similar ideas, but we've become a very different people as a consequence of this. And being attentive to what this does to ourselves, being attentive to the intersections between societies. We are going to continue nation building somewhere, sometime, maybe not in the next budget cycle, but we will. And these are questions we should ask ourselves. And there might be places where we should do this. There might be many places we'll be tempted to do this where we shouldn't do this. And we need to think deeply about this. I've written this history not because I think there's a formula for this, not because I think I have all the answers, not even because I think I know everything about all the cases. No one could, studying 200 years know all that. But because I think there are some timeless questions that this historical analysis could lead us to ask, and questions that will get us out of a bifurcated for or against nation-building approach, but instead a deeper question about how the requisite power that we have, even if it is diminishing, can be used more effectively for things we believe in, things we will always, I think, as an American society, continue to believe in. So I'll leave it at that.
Thank you. Great. Thank you, Jeremy. To launch us into the discussion this afternoon that I hope in a few minutes will involve all of you. So get your questions ready. We've dragged all the way across town one of this country's leading historians, and we're happy to say a Wilson Center alumnus, John McNeill, who of course is university professor at Georgetown University, where he holds dual appointments in a way like Jeremy at the Georgetown School of Foreign Service and the History Department. Prior to being named university professor, he was the Cinco Hermanos Chair of Environment and International Affairs in the School of Foreign Service. He's taught at Goucher College in Towson and at Duke University, and received both his master's and doctorate from Duke. He is one of the most accomplished historians of this country, including won a number of prestigious awards and fellowships, and including the American Historical Association's 2011 Albert Beveridge Award for his most recent publication, and in 2010 he won the Toynbee Prize for Academic and Public Contributions to Humanity. Now that's an award. He is the president of the American Society of Environmental History, and has held a number of other distinguished fellowships and grants, from the MacArthur Foundation's Program on Global Security and Sustainability to fellowships from Guggenheim and Fulbright. He has a long list of publications to his credit. Let me just name a few. Mosquito Empires, Ecology and War in the Greater Caribbean, 1640 to 1914, and Something New Under the Sun, an environmental history of the 20th century world, which won the World History Association's Book Prize and Weyerhaeuser Book Prize as well. It's a great pleasure to have you back and look forward to your remarks, John.
Thank you, Christian. It is great to be back. That last book you mentioned, I wrote while a Wilson Center Fellow. It's the best fellowship I ever held. I want to ask Jeremy a question right off the bat. Jeremy, you are the Mac Brown professor at the University of Texas. Is Mac Brown the football coach?
He is, yes.
I see. Does this mean you get fired if they have a losing record?
Well, I don't think that's true. It certainly doesn't mean I get his $5 million salary. Let's make that clear.
I didn't even need to ask about that. Okay. I think Jeremy may be unique in having a professorship named after a football coach, but I hope it's the wave of the future. I am not a historian of U.S. foreign policy, so in some respects I am an imposter sitting in this position. I have as my main credential the fact that I've read the book. But I read it in a pre-publication copy, and so Jeremy has the perfect defense if I make any criticism. He can merely say that he's changed it, and it's not in the real book. We'll see to what extent what I read and what was ultimately published coincide. So here's what I read. A book that makes a forceful argument for the notion of continuity across 220 years of U.S. history, continuity in nation building as an ambition and nation building as an effort on the part of the U.S. government and U.S. society. And I don't need to tell you that it's unusual for historians of U.S. foreign policy to range over 220 years for academic historians of U.S. foreign policy to range over 220 years. It is to be encouraged, of course. The book is also clearly written for contemporary policy dilemmas and the contemporary policy community, urging that when Americans take up nation building, they need to be patient and they need to be prepared to weather the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune. And then the book ends with the 5 Ps that Jeremy ended with here. The nation building must consist, to be successful, must consist of partnership, processes, problem solving, purpose, and people. I'm always reflexively skeptical of any book that has 5 Ps or 4 Rs or anything like that in it.
Me too.
And to be fair, the book is a historical analysis. It is not a Blythe recipe. So I'll make a few comments about specific parts of the book and a few questions for Jeremy. And it'll be hard sometimes to tell the difference between the comments and the questions. The lines will be fuzzy. So Jeremy, you take some notes in case you want to defend yourself against some of these suggestions. First of all, the argument that when Americans take up nation building, they need to be patient. Okay, nobody's going to object to that. But how patient? The problem here is that neither the Mac Brown professor nor anybody else can tell us how patient you have to be with a nation-building effort. In the case of Reconstruction, maybe you could say it was 12 years, 1865 to 1877, but you might also think it was 100 years until the Civil Rights Act. That's a long time by most calculations. In the case of the Philippines, 1898 to 1946, maybe, that would be then 48 years worth of nation building in that case. Germany, it's tougher to say. Beginning in 1945, when did the nation-building effort end in Germany? You could say that maybe by the Berlin crisis, West Germany was on its feet, or maybe you would say not until reunification in 1989. So it might be on the order of 16 years or maybe 44 years. But one cannot possibly know going in whether the commitment is going to be 10, 12 years or 40 to 50 years. And this makes it really hard, politically, for anybody to undertake this honestly. And makes it very tempting for the people in power who want to undertake it dishonestly and say, we'll be done in a couple of years, and it'll only cost a couple of billion, which, as Surest shows, is never the case and never is going to be the case. The three cases that he holds up as the best results, and he does sometimes call them successes, at least in the pre-publication copy, are Reconstruction, the Philippines, and Germany. So in a time period undertaken between, or launched between 1865 and 1945, which was a time when the U.S. was probably the tiger of the world economy, growing by 6, 8, 10% per annum. Even during most of the Depression years of the 1930s, after 1933, the U.S. economy was growing fast. So here's another question. Can one imagine nation-building commitments in more constrained economic times than those of 1865 to 1945 or even to 1970? The big investment is harder to justify. The staying power, the willpower to stick it out is, I should think, more likely to be undermined in more constrained economic times. So I wonder, therefore, if we are in more constrained economic times now, does that mean that the U.S. should enter into nation-building commitments more reluctantly, less frequently than it has done in the past? Jeremy says in the book, in a few places, that nation-building is in the DNA of the United States. And if that's so, it suggests it's not going to be easy to resist the temptation to continue doing it. But one wonders whether the economic circumstances and economic trajectory are not really important contingent variables in these equations. My next point is about what I call degree of difficulty, as in Olympic diving. At many points in the book, Jeremy says nation building is difficult, and it's hard to argue with that. But what he doesn't do is say which cases were more difficult than others on balance. And, of course, many variables go into making it more or less difficult. My guess is that, counterintuitively, the biggest commitments of the examples that he includes were the easiest, Reconstruction and the German case. Partly because in both instances this was nation rebuilding. The starting point was a bit more advanced. In the case of the American South in 1865, the elites had nowhere to go, no option except to cooperate with Reconstruction authorities. And the German elites in 1945 had every reason to cooperate because the Red Army was none too far away, and an alternative to working things out with the Americans was too bitter to contemplate. Moreover, both the Civil War and the Second World War were big total wars, so that the tolerance for a big commitment on the part of both American society and the American government, I think, was higher. Because I'm suggesting here the bigness of the war corresponds to the willingness to invest in winning the peace. And little wars seem to justify lesser commitments to winning the peace. That's a suggestion, but it can easily be translated into a question. And now my last main point is about the case selection. Reconstruction, the Philippines, Germany, those are the most cheerful outcomes. Vietnam, Iraq, and Afghanistan. And the Iraq and Afghanistan, the wheel is still in spin. We don't really know what those are going to look like ultimately. So my question here is why these cases are not others. For example, no Japan. Japan might have been a cheerful case, although one could argue that it wasn't really nation building because there was a Japanese nation before 1941 and it didn't need to be reconstructed, just rerouted a little bit. Why not Haiti? For 15 years, the U.S. Marines occupied Haiti. They invested, U.S. Marines and some civilian authorities, built roads, built bridges, built schools, built sanitation systems. Sounds like they were trying to do nation building. Probably it looks, from today's vantage point, like a less cheerful case. But in any event, there has to be a selection. You can't do everything in a book. Why these and why not some of the other plausible cases? I said that was my last main point. This one then counts as a minor point, and that is if nation building is indeed in the DNA of Americans, is this another form of American exceptionalism? Or do other peoples have nation building in their DNA too? Is this one variant of the temptations put before great powers at their moments of opportunity and strength? Or is it something peculiar to the Americans? You can, I think, argue it both ways, and I'd like to hear Jeremy argue for whichever way he believes. And there's one other last tiny point, which is about a certain ambivalence that I found, at least in the pre-publication copy, about expertise. Mm-hmm. There are places in the book where Jeremy writes that expertise is overrated. And Taft, in the Philippines in particular, didn't know anything about the Philippines. He was a lawyer and a judge from Ohio. But, according to Jerry, he did lots of things right. And indeed, because he knew nothing about the Philippines, he had an open mind and was objective about issues within that society. It was, in effect, strange as it may seem, advantageous to know nothing about the Philippines. However, when discussing the German case, he lauds Herbert Hoover on a 1945 tour of German cities for knowing a lot about the German situation. Now, I don't know whether Taft was all that ignorant, and I don't know whether Hoover was all that knowledgeable, but it seems to me there's a ambivalence in the text about the value of knowing a lot about the nation that you're trying to nation build. So I'd ask Jeremy to speak a little bit about that issue as well. That's it, except for a tiny academic nitpicking, which I will forego.
Which you already have engaged in, I think, just before the start of the session, right?
So, corrections.
That's there as well. Thank you, John, for these really, I think, extremely helpful, brilliant remarks. Let me give Jeremy first, I think, take 5-10 minutes to respond to these points. These are, I think, really important points, and I'd like you to take the time to respond in full, and then we'll open it up.
Great, and thank you, John, for those great comments and for that very thoughtful reading. And I'll try to answer the questions, but some of them I don't have good answers to. I think when we write a book, we try to figure things out as best we can, but there always are unanswered questions. And I've always thought the sign of the kind of book I like is a book that actually leads to a lot of questions that one wants to answer. So I'll just start from the beginning of your all big comments. There's some you called big, some you didn't call big. How patient does one have to be? And you're right. It's not revolutionary to say that things take time, especially when you're trying to change another society. How patient does one have to be? I don't have a specific answer, and I'd be skeptical of anyone who does. But the point I try to make repeatedly in the book is that patience involves at least something longer than our electoral cycles, and that each of these cases goes well beyond that. And so when one gets involved in these, the barest honesty is to say that you're doing something that doesn't fit the electoral cycles that we operate in and doesn't fit the budget cycles that we operate in as well. And that's how I want to answer in part your second question about economic constraints. Economic constraints matter enormously in the kinds of short-term choices we make. But economic constraints also themselves vary. So you might argue there's a long-term trend in the amount of resources available to the United States. As I think you rightly said, John, coming out of the late 19th century, the United States is, I think you called it the tiger economy. But it also has some pretty serious troughs in its experience in that period, particularly the 1930s. And so the commitments that Americans make are commitments made in a particular economic moment, but the commitments outlast that economic moment and will be interacting with the changes in the economic moments over time. And the problem that I see repeatedly is that assumptions are made when going into one of these activities that the economic moment you're in will be constant and live on for the period you are involved, which is to say the presumption is if you go in good times, as you're more likely to when you feel more flush with resources, that those times will last. And if you decide not to go in or to go in a way that might be less expensive, you're doing it in a time when your resources are less flush, and the presumption that they will remain less flush as you go forward. And that's one of the problems with planning, because it takes time to ramp up your resources, but the economic environment you're operating in shifts considerably. That's one of the reasons I think that the more successful nation builders are ones who build in flexible processes. Processes that are not dependent upon a specific economic moment, might be dependent upon some presumption of resources. But let's be frank, even in a moment today where we have a serious debt crisis, where we're going to be entering into some major cuts that were unthinkable even 18 months ago, nonetheless, the United States still has a lot of resources. And if you think I'm wrong, think about how expensive each of those drones is. Right? We still have a lot of resources, right? And so how we use those resources, even in a period of economic constraint, I don't think is dictated by the aggregate environment we're in. Yeah.
Could you just, on this, could you just specify what you mean by flexible processes?
I think processes that, and I again, I don't have a formula for this, but I try to just describe it in the cases, processes that are not dependent upon a continual infusion of money, nor dependent upon a particular individual or a particular party. And I think those are the two mistakes we fall into. The presumption, and this is sometimes what the experts fall into, that we'll always have the money to invest in the cool technology, or the presumption that we've found our guy. A flexible approach to this, and I think this is, for instance, what Taft was trying to do in the Philippines, is to establish a broad range of people you act with and a broad range of resources that you're bringing to bear. Now, that usually prolongs the period in which you're involved. The political answer is usually to say, I have the silver bullet and we'll use it. But I think that's actually that's inflexible, and that leads to many of the problems that we run into time and again. Again, Vietnam's a classic case of this. Johnson presumes he's going to have these resources to continue throwing at it, and he doesn't, or he doesn't perceive that he does 3 or 4 years in. Degree of difficulty. I love that phrase. I was thinking of gymnastics because my daughter does gymnastics, and I'm always looking and saying that's a degree of difficulty I can't even imagine. The degree of difficulty issue, I think this matters, but I think this is less a constant as well. And I think it's particularly wrong to say that it was easier in Germany than it was or could have been in a place like the Philippines or the American South. Difficulty can be defined in many ways. Take the American South, for an example. There were severe limitations to what the Union would do to its own citizens from the Confederacy. there were severe limitations to what Americans would consider even for freed slaves. So even in conditions which look easier than a Vietnam, you have depths of difficulty as well. So I think that's a hard thing to measure, and I don't think that's as indicative or as determinative of the outcome as it might seem at first glance. I think what you put in is actually more important, and the relationships you build, than the pre-existing conditions on the ground are. Case selection. Why did I select the cases that I selected? Well, there are two answers to that. I selected the cases I knew and that I was interested in, and I love being a historian because I am willing to defend that position. I think we can create all kinds of illusions of objective case selection, but I didn't write about Japan as much as I wanted to because I don't speak Japanese, and I don't have access to the sources, and I wanted to write about the cases that I felt I could actually do a good job with. And the other reason I chose the cases I chose was because I made the judgment, and maybe this was justifying my own pre-existing interests, that these were the cases, or these were among the cases that were most generational, that had a huge and lasting effect upon the generation of policymakers involved at the time. Haiti was important, but did not have the generational effect that the Civil War had or that the Philippines had. And in each of these cases, I make the argument in the book, and I should have brought this out, that one case influences the next, so that there's a chronological string from one to the other. I don't think you could make quite the same causal connection to Haiti as such. Exceptionalism, I do think, and I have elsewhere and will defend, I do think there is an American exceptionalism, a strange and peculiar way in which Americans approach nation building, but it doesn't mean we're the only ones who do this. You can make the case for many other societies, but we do it a particular way. And by the way, to say there's American exceptionalism is not to say there aren't other exceptionalisms or that American exceptionalism is better. It doesn't have to be coded normatively to say there is something peculiar about the way Americans think about politics. And then, and anyone who's in this city has to think that every day. I don't see how you could be in this city otherwise. And then expertise. I'm not skeptical of expertise because who are we? We're experts. We have no claim to legitimacy otherwise.
Speak for yourself.
Or we claim to be experts. I'm skeptical about experts who believe, in David Halberstam's terms, that they have all the answers. The experts, and the reason I like someone like Hoover in the case of Germany, is because I think he brings a lot of expertise about how to work with different people and how to listen, at least in an economic context, to business people and other societies that proves very effective for the United States. The kind of expertise I'm most skeptical about is the kind of technocratic expertise, or what some would say is a modernizing impulse to go in and actually not listen but dictate to people. And I think it's very hard for Americans to draw that distinction. You can be an expert and a partner and a listener, or you can be an expert and a technocrat and a formula provider. And if anything, this book is an argument for the former kind of expertise, the humanistic expertise, not the technocratic expertise. But that's a predictable thing for me to say, right?
Great. Thank you. Floor is open. If you could please, in Wilson Center tradition, wait for the microphone since we're taping, and state your name and affiliation if you like. We'll go with the gentleman over there and then work our way around the room.
My name is Stephen Short. The risk of implying that you might have written a different book than the one you actually wrote, it seems that the word building implies our right to reconstruct societies, specifically after we've defeated them in war. But one could say that from the viewpoint of other nations, what we might call building is destruction of an existing order. Mm-hmm. And you may, on a case-by-case basis, say that the destruction was warranted and that the society that emerged was better off for having been destroyed. Austria-Hungary, as a consequence of Versailles, was not, you couldn't call that nation building. Austria-Hungary disappeared. Imperial Germany was split in two, lost a fair amount of its population, and one could say that, and which it would not have happened but for American intervention in 1917.
Right.
Cuba became a protectorate, and this arguably was not really nation building in the way the Cubans would have wanted it. Mexico would not view the loss of 1/3 of its territory in the Mexican War as nation building, and arguably might have been better built if it had not lost so much of its territory.
Sure.
So
sure.
I'm wondering, do you give any emphasis to the viewpoint of loss and destruction, of national destruction as a prelude or concomitant to our happy nation building?
Right. Well, first of all, I'm not sure it's happy nation building, but it's a great question, Stephen, and thank you. And it relates to one of the other points John brought up that I neglected to answer, and I apologize, was the question about total war. There's no doubt that building tends to occur after destruction, often destruction that we have one way or another been a part of. So there's no doubt that those two things go hand in hand. And in every case that I can think of, there are many who fit exactly what you just say, which is see what Americans perceive as building and what many locals see as building as a kind of destruction as well. Take the Philippines. When Taft goes in and tries to build new schools, many people see that destroying a traditional way of life, and they're absolutely right about that, and it's imposing a certain way of living. So there is always a different point of view. And I hope the book acknowledges that, but the book is about, and it's just what the book is about how Americans and their partners have perceived this and what Americans have been trying to do. And I think that's the continuity. Different societies, and they have every right, and you might sympathize more with the rejection of building and the perception of building as being destruction. But I think one of the key points here, and it's the kind of double entendre in the title, is that from Washington on, Americans perceive that they have to build nations to make the world safe for the kind of existence they want to have at home as well as overseas. That's the ambition. It's not always the result, and it's not always the shared perception by others. But I do think it's the continuity in what Americans are doing and what we fall back on.
Mm-hmm. Gentleman in the center there, yeah? Mm-hmm. Yep, you. Just wait for the microphone.
Eric Arneson, George Washington University and the Wilson Center. Haven't read the book, so I only have to go on what you've offered us today. But I'm genuinely curious about the Civil War as one of your case studies, or Reconstruction. The notion of Americans, or a we, in plotting out a Reconstruction path strikes me as a bit misplaced. The President of the United States spoke of restoration, not Reconstruction. Congressional Republicans were at complete odds with congressional Democrats. Republicans were divided amongst themselves. This was a process that kind of unfolded piecemeal, and depending on the decade, I would say few historians would conclude that it was successful. Yes, African Americans are at least temporarily enfranchised. There are some constitutional amendments, but with a very short attention span and a very divided polity, whatever promise, at least those believing in equality or civil rights had, those go out the window very, very quickly as the government throws up its hands, loses interest, and or comes to side with those that it had defeated on the battlefield.
Right. Eric, I think all that's right. I wouldn't argue with that. And definitely the scholarship from Eric Foner and others, he's just one of many, make exactly this point and make this point very persuasively. And most historians that I've read on this period say that Reconstruction is actually more of a failure than a success. Absolutely. My argument is that there are, in spite of that, certain things that are transformed in the South to make it approximate the northern industrial nation, and that there is this line of continuity that runs despite all of these other setbacks that might be more significant if you're a scholar of African American civil rights, or if you're a scholar of labor, or if you're a scholar of class. But if you're thinking about the structuring of the politics of the South, and you're thinking about the structuring of what the United States post-1865 will look like, I think actually Charles Beard got it right, which is to say that the South becomes part of a northern industrial economy with a free labor, free soil, free men perspective. This is Foner's earlier work, right? And that what this meant was not equality. It did not mean fairness. All those promises were not fulfilled, certainly not for 100 years, as John pointed out also, but that the slave system was ended, a capitalist economy was created in the South, and that the institutions in the South were made at least the level of white empowerment to approximate the North in the way they hadn't before. And that transformation is significant. Now, that transformation is not equally felt by everyone, and it in fact hurts a lot of people too. But you could imagine other paths after the Civil War beyond that. In fact, Andrew Johnson imagined a different path, I think. So that's the point I'm making there. And I do also focus on, as other scholars have, African American self-help and education that occurs within this context. It gets some help from missionaries, but there is a space created for that as well. And as you know, probably better than I do, there's a whole literature on that too.
Great. Kenton? Front here.
Hi, I'm Kenton Clymer, a scholar here working on a history of U.S. relations with Burma, which I don't think probably will fit into your book in any way.
But you've written on the Philippines, right?
I have written on the Philippines, and I actually had some questions about the Philippine thing. You call it a success. It seems, in a sense, getting back to maybe the first question, it almost seems as if you're accepting kind of the imperialist rhetoric of the times, that these people are incapable of self-government and they need someone to come in and build a society for them. I mean, the Philippines had a highly literate class. The people in the first Philippine Assembly were as highly educated, if not more so, than the people in the U.S. Congress, for example. So that's kind of one problem, I guess, I have. The other thing is a little bit different, and that is the argument that's been made in terms of the Philippine experience, that the Filipinos were simply smart enough to adopt certain American forms, but in fact not much changed. The same kind of political arrangements that they had had before in terms of the elite kind of dominating everything has continued on to the present day. And so the Americans didn't really change anything all that significantly except for the forms. I'm not sure if I fully agree with that analysis, but that analysis has certainly been put forward.
Right.
So.
Great questions, and I'll begin by saying you know far more about the Philippines than I do, Ken. And I've read your work on this, so I've tried to steal what you know, but I don't know nearly as much as you know about the Philippines. And my research has been on the American side of the story. I haven't done the kind of on the ground research that you and others have done in the Philippines. I don't think though that calling the Philippines a partial success means that you're buying into the imperialist rhetoric. I'm not even buying in, I don't think, to the imperialist rhetoric of Taft after he leaves. I'm more focused on what he does when he's there. And I am struck with, in the period of Taft's civil governorship, so we're talking 1900 to about 1908 or so, roughly speaking. He's also obviously Secretary of War in that period as well. That during this period, Taft does some pretty remarkable things. He doesn't create a literate society where there wasn't, and he certainly works with the elites that are pre-existing. But he does create a basis for civil government that didn't exist before, and in particular the Philippine Assembly. He puts an emphasis upon mass education that didn't exist before. And I think he takes the Philippines out of what had been much more, I think, of an imperial dependency in the Spanish Empire and what it would have looked like, I think, in the German or British Empire if the Americans had not been there, and contributed to the creation of some kind of what we might recognize as further civil society more than was there before. That is not to say that what he did was not racist. It was racist. It was condescending. It was paternalistic. But I'm struck with his effort, his sincere efforts, and not entirely unsuccessful, in some cases successful, to actually improve some elements of civil society there. And it's not, I don't sympathize with that because I think Filipinos were incapable of doing this, or incapable, whatever the right word is. I sympathize with this because I think the Spanish Empire, like most empires, had worked against that in all cases. And Taft, to some extent, on some of these issues, reversed the trend. My favorite example is education. The Spanish had not created mass education in Spanish in the Philippines. They didn't want the Filipinos, as you know better than I think this is in your own work, to speak Spanish. Taft wants to create a middle class, in his terms, of English speakers so they can be economically empowered. Of course, empowered in our terms, but that's exactly what we're talking about here. So I see Taft in a relatively positive light, but that doesn't negate the racism that's certainly there.
Mm-hmm. Who's next? Yeah.
I'm Sang Yun Ma at the Brookings University at the moment. My question is about your use of concept path dependence. You argued that probably all the experiences of Americans would have made a very consistent effort of nation building afterwards. But my question is actually, you suggested several experiences already, and I come to wonder if each experience made some kind of modification in American way of thinking of nation building and their efforts.
Sure. That's precisely the argument in both versions of the book, in the one John's right, and in all versions of the book, I think, which is that it's path dependence in that, and this is the first chapter, the founding moment, the experience, the way Americans invent a new way of thinking about this in their own terms is crucial, but then its application with each successive generation builds upon that, but also helps to modify that. So the paradigm is there, but the paradigm is modeled as we go along, and that's, again, why I've chosen these cases, because I think these are some of the cases that contribute to some of the modifications. So just to quickly sketch that out, the way at least I sketch it out in the book, there is this notion of creating a new people that didn't exist before called Americans, and a new government that didn't exist before called the United States that would have, in Edmund Morgan's terms, this fictional relationship. They're Americans because there's a government because they're Americans. Well, neither had existed before. That new kind of sovereignty, that nation state, that Madisonian pluralism, then it gets a military inflection with the Civil War. Then with the Philippines, it gets an inflection connected to the building of civil government overseas. With Germany, it gets connected to economic reconstruction in a way it wasn't before. In Vietnam, with the stuff many people in this room have written about, modernization aspirations, dams, things of that sort, modern technology. And in Afghanistan and Iraq with the obvious, right, counterinsurgency, right? All of these things had antecedents as well. But the paradigm gets connected to new tools and gets slightly redefined as we go along, but it's never starting from scratch. It's deeply affected by all the prior experiences. That's what makes it so hard for us to think out of it today. That's my argument.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. John, feel free to chime in at any time. Yeah? Just let me know.
Feel free.
Okay, very good. Gentleman over here.
This is nice to have a pause to think.
David Seepley, University of Denver, and a fellow here for the year. Jeremy, thanks for a really compelling presentation. In it, you sometimes in presentation, some of the finer grained stuff in the book gets left out, and I also haven't had a chance to look at it. At least in the presentation, you talk about the American approach to nation building. And I'm just wondering if you don't actually see some more internal dissensus and what that might look like. Some years back, Walter Russell Mead published what I think is a good book, not a great title, but anyway, called Special Providence. I figured you'd be familiar with it. And there he distinguishes 4 different schools of American thinking about foreign policy. 2 of them would be generally quite sympathetic to nation building, what he calls the Wilsonian and the Hamiltonian, although they would have some of the different emphases within that. 2 would be rather critical of it in general, what he calls the Jacksonian and Jeffersonian, each initially embedded in a regional culture, but now kind of disassociated from those particular regions, just more general schools of thought. I found them very helpful for thinking through American foreign policy. So I was just curious if you've thought through this material at all in terms of those particular categories, or any other kinds of general, distinct views of foreign policy that would give us also patterns of, there's definitely always pushing and pulling and shoving about what exactly is this going to look like in the end? What should we be doing? Should we be doing this at all?
Sure.
And if that too falls into certain characteristic patterns that you see
Sure.
throughout all these engagements.
So this is a great question.
Pass it down to yeah.
It's a great question, David. And I also find, and David Rodriguez, who's taught with me, knows, I find using these schools very helpful. And there are a number of books that do this. Walt Russell Mead, Walter McDougall, a whole number of scholars have done this in different ways. And it gets across what you're absolutely right about, which is that we're a pluralistic society. And there are many different viewpoints. And I always tell students there's not a single foreign commitment the United States has made that didn't involve major criticism at home. World War II is the possible exception, but even there, that's not really true. So it's very American to have multiple points of view, as it is true in many other societies too. That said, what I also usually argue, and what I believe, is that within these schools of thought, there still are tendencies that tend to bring them together, and ways in which figures in these separate schools of thought end up converging on certain issues. And I think nation building is one of them. And I think in almost every one of these cases, we have figures who start out being against it because they're in one of the other schools coming to it. In fact, the book is not filled with Wilsonians. It's filled with people like, and you might say they're the main protagonists in the book, Oliver Otis Howard, William Howard Taft, Herbert Hoover, guys who are not necessarily people who share my politics, who are actually pretty conservative and tend to be pretty skeptical about idealistic enterprises overseas. But they time and again get pulled in that direction when they don't see an alternative that matches with what they see as the pressing needs of the time and the commitments that have been already made. And again, I think Taft is a wonderful example of this. He tells McKinley, Taft's a wonderful person to write about because we have microfilm, reel upon microfilm of his papers, and the originals are, of course, the Library of Congress. And he wrote letters every night to his wife and his brothers, and so we can, and they would need handwriting, so you can actually read them. And Taft recounts how when McKinley approaches him to go to the Philippines, he says, I don't think we should be there. But now that we're there, we have to do something. So he himself is not in any of the interventionist schools, but finds himself believing that once we're there, once we've made this path-dependent commitment, there's something we have to do. So I think these schools are helpful in showing preferences. But of course, in real-world circumstances, in the circumstances of American interaction with larger forces and larger phenomenon, these schools tend to still converge in certain way. So another example that would be the President George W. Bush. I think he was sincere. I'm pretty sure Condi was sincere when she said, we're not going to do nation building. And look what happened after September 11th. I don't think they were lying before that, but the circumstances pulled them toward this convergent position.
All right.
Yuri Borovsky, I'm an international student from Ukraine, and I'd like to ask you this question. To what extent do you discuss the cultural value system here in America and in other countries in the process of nation building? And what I'm referring to is that Americans, for the most part, with the exception of slaves, are self-selected people who chose to come to this land to build new families, new lives, and a new nation. And then in other countries, people chose not to leave their country, not to leave their current system. How do you compare this cultural systems in different countries?
Well, it's a great question. It's as the child of immigrants myself, it's something I think about a lot. One of the reasons I think that Americans are exceptional in their approach to nation building is because that's the story Americans tell themselves. Now, we can debate, and many in this room would debate, how true that proposition is, that Americans are self-selected and have chosen to be here. And it might be true, might not. But I don't think that actually, the facts of that don't actually matter. That's part of American self-identity. And that's part of the reason why nation building is the default position, because the presumption is that there are ways in which people can build a better future for themselves. We have done that, and we will help other societies to do that. And if they do that, that will be in our interest as well. They will naturally be our friends, and we will not need to be an empire, but we'll still get the benefits from that.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Gentleman over there.
It's a great discussion so far and great topic. Thanks, Jeremy. My question is kind of...
Can you just introduce yourself, please?
Oh, yes. Misha Honig from the German Historical Institute. Where are the international institutions in this whole conversation about American nation building? Because I kind of think that, Reconstruction and Germany, Vietnam, and the latter cases are oceans apart for the mere fact of the rise of international and intergovernmental institutions in the 20th century. United Nations, League of Nations, NATO. And I was wondering if you think that American nation building was facilitated or obstructed by the existence of these institutions.
Well, it's a great question, Misha, and certainly, as you and Akira Irie and others have written, that these institutions certainly rise in number, though, of course, as you yourself have shown, they go back in time, too. I think these institutions matter, but I think in the end, and this is one of the arguments in the book, it's a world of nation-states, and I think it's becoming more a world of nation-states than ever before. One of the other arguments I make in the book that I didn't want to put out in the presentation because that would start another whole debate is that actually a world of nation-states might in fact be better. There might be more stability in that. And that's actually the way the world is going. International institutions still matter enormously. And I think of if I had done a chapter on Bosnia or East Timor, that would have been a crucial part of the story. But still, the money and the resources largely come from nation-states. And if there isn't will from the strong nation-states, it doesn't happen on a large scale, especially in places that are strategically valuable to a lot of people. Many international institutions, I think, survive and succeed because they play into the nation-state system, right? Which is, of course, why the Palestinians want to be recognized as a nation-state at the United Nations, which is why the Kurds have a disadvantage. The WTO is another example of this, right? You are recognized as a nation-state. You adjudicate as nation-states. You negotiate a deal in as nation-states. So I think the international institution system works and does certain things, especially in possessing knowledge and resources at some level. But it does that by connecting to the nation-state system. And I think that's still the meat and potatoes of international affairs. And so I'm a bit of a traditionalist on that. And I'm also a bit of a believer that a world of nation-states actually could be pretty stable. And I'm less sanguine about a world of international institutions and things like that.
Hi, my name is Ria Che, originally from Seoul National University, now Wilson Center. My question is, to what extent is nation building by the U.S. abroad is due to idealistic way of thinking, or maybe it's just serving American economic interests? My specialty is just past 50 years, so it's a much shorter period than 200 years you were dealing with. But what I saw was when, for example, Rostow was clearly, he studied one of the biggest nation-building projects by the United States in East Asia. He was clearly saying that it would help United States bind those nations to the world economic system. So whether it was just idealistic way of thinking, oh, they better look like us, or it was more practical interests of just making them dependent on us, or just making them, economically connected to the United States.
So this is a good question, but I think it's a distinction that works well for academics but doesn't work well for policy, which is to say it's very hard for me to think of policymakers who are not both idealistic and economically motivated at the same time. And we have a president like that now who I think is a quintessential example of that. And I think that's true for most policymakers. I see very little evidence of policymakers ever saying, well, we've said this stuff in public, but now here's what we really mean. Right? Generally, policymakers do things that they believe are the right things to do, but that are also in their economic interest. And generally, that's how most of us behave. Our ideals also serve our economic interests. How often do you advocate for something that doesn't actually help you in one way or another? And I think that's what the United States is doing. So this is not in any way an argument that nation building is altruism. I don't think altruism, it certainly doesn't exist in the international system. I'm not even sure it exists within families. So this is not an argument for that. This is an argument for a set of principles Americans have consistently pursued, which they believe will make themselves better and others better. And I think they've been sincere in that. Now we have to point out the difficulties and complications that have come along the way. But that's how I think these things have been pursued, and that's how I would discuss the last 10 years as well as the last 200 years.
All right. Don?
Don Wolfensberger with Congress Studies here at the Wilson Center. I was wondering whether you might tease out a little bit more what you mean by nation building being part of U.S. DNA, because to me that means hardwired, and I see a different historical pattern, one of ambivalence among the American people, going from isolationism to involvement in the world and back to isolationism. And I think a lot of our involvement over the last 50, 60 years has been driven by the Cold War, and that's why I think Americans were willing to commit and be more involved. But I'm just wondering now whether you're seeing a pulling back somewhat, especially with some of the things that are going on in Afghanistan and Iraq, and the idea that somehow you're going to have to be there 10, 20 years if you're really going to make a difference and help rebuild these societies.
Don, I think that's a great point, and Congress is a great place, of course, to see those debates. And this comes back to David's excellent question about different traditions. There's no doubt that there has always been ambivalence about how involved the United States should be in the world and what role the United States should directly play. And even at the height of the Cold War, those debates, there was this, Senator Robert Taft, who, if he hadn't been sick, might have become a more major figure in the Republican Party in the 1950s. Eisenhower himself had ambivalence about these issues, as did many members of Congress. So that ambivalence about how directly to be involved and what the United States should do is there, and it's there in every case. But I think what is consistent, and the reason I start with Washington, is even in a document like the Farewell Address, which is about not getting involved in entangling alliances, deeply presumes that, as Washington puts it, through the gentle hand of commerce, the world will come to look more like us. So the American presumption, what's hardwired in, is this belief that the world should look like us, that we should not be a world of empire, coded as 18th, 19th century world, or a world of chaos, or even international institutions and world governance, but of nation states that are representative and legitimate on that basis, that have clear territorial demarcations, and that involve within them a government that actually serves the people and a people that serves the government as a united entity not defined by ethnicity but defined by nationalism. And Americans consistently come back to that in the ways they view the world, and consistently come back to that even when they're not directly involved in the kinds of world they think they are building one way or another. Even the isolationists. So take someone like Bob La Follette. When he's arguing against the Paris Peace Treaty, he's not arguing against a world of nation states. He's arguing against the United States entangling itself in alliances in trying to build that outcome. His argument is we will build that world better if we're a model rather than a direct intervener. So that's what I mean by hardwired into the DNA. It's the vision Americans have. My test for this is how other imperial traditions view crises that we view on a daily basis. It struck me, maybe others will correct me, it struck me that for the British it made much more sense to think of Iraq as separate ethnic groups and dividing this entity that they themselves had put together. It was almost unthinkable for Americans to think of Iraq as anything but a nation state. We never had a debate about that, did we? What it should look, even when all the bad things were happening, really, really bad things. We never had a debate about what it should look like. It should be a nation state. It's Iraq, even though we all know it's a figment of people's imaginations to some extent. And you see how far he got with that, right?
Okay, we're quickly running out of time. Let's take a few questions at a time and then give Jeremy and possibly John a chance to respond. So, the gentleman over there.
Thomas Floydis from George Mason University. I had a quick question following up on John's point about case selection. And wondering about, my expertise is sort of kind of more modern era, so not looking back into the 19th century. But since the end of World War II, the United States gets involved in more cases and in a wider set of cases, not just places that look like Germany or the American South, but a bunch of places that have essentially no effective history of governance, of democracy, of effective, stable governance at all, other than colonial governance, and sometimes not even that. Right, and so the United States is now involved in arguably much harder cases. And just looking at the 6 that you're studying, the places where the effort doesn't go well are in the places that look a lot like the places we're intervening in now and will continue to, not only in headlining cases like Iraq and Afghanistan, but also in places like Mozambique, right, or places like Liberia or places like Sierra Leone, where it's part of a multilateral sort of effort. We're sort of trying to quickly install elections, have 6 months after a peace agreement, hold an election, right? So I'm thinking a little bit about what your thoughts are about kind of success in such cases, particularly when the cases we're selecting into now are only getting harder.
Okay, thanks. And Jeremy, take a moment to think about it. We'll go to this gentleman down here and then all the way back there. Down here. Thanks.
You're going to answer Thomas's question, David?
I know we've been focusing a lot on the elite policymakers. In your research, I wanted to know. David Rodriguez. I am a PhD candidate at the University of Wisconsin, and I currently work at the Department of State. In your research on nation building, I wanted to know if what your research has, what you came across with the people on the ground and how they responded to nation building, and how nation building informed their perceptions of Americans over time, beginning with the Philippines and ending or currently with Afghanistan and Iraq.
Mm-hmm. And now the lady in the back. Anybody else who can't live without asking a question today? All right, but no, we'll go. Go ahead, just have him too, and then
I'll get to yours too. Don't worry.
Yeah.
Hi, Ryan Jacobs from the House Armed Services Committee. I had a quick question in regards to when you were talking about the technocratic versus the more flexible approaches within a bureaucracy towards nation building. Now in our current debates in counterinsurgency, you have the military versus civilian, or the mixing of military and civilian aid. So in your research, what did you find perhaps the more effective way of doing it? And just could you expand on how the military side of it works and how the perhaps economic and foreign service side of it works as well? Thank you.
All right. I think that's got to be our final question.
I guess there are too many questions. My name is Tatiana Yindina. I'm Fulbright scholar from Russia, Moscow, here in Kennan Institute Woodrow Wilson Center. Thank you, Jeremy. And I have a question on political voting, because we study decision-making in political voting in Russia and in America. And I would like to ask you to describe, if you can describe, a portrait of American voters. So how do they behave? Which attitude do they have to political voting in America? And can you describe the mentality of average American political voter?
Wow.
So we're just doing cross-cultural study, and your expert opinion will be really interesting. Thank you.
This has always been my experience in on my trips to Russia. You get asked these huge questions that are great questions, and then it's always doubly difficult when I'm asked in Russian, because my Russian is good, but I often figure, have I missed the, it's so big. Okay, let me think about yours. I'll do the others and then come to yours, Tatiana. Spasiba. So Thomas raised a great question about the nature of the cases being different as the United States has become involved in more kinds of places, and also as the world has become more complex. You have more places that are separate states than they were before. There just are more of them. And I think that does matter a lot, and it is one of the things that makes it harder as one goes. I don't think one should deny that. It makes it harder just for the very fact that Americans are on more unfamiliar ground, even more unfamiliar than in other times. And there are so many more actors. But I do think it still doesn't determine the outcomes. I think one of the reasons Americans fail more than they succeed after the beginning of the Cold War is actually the most depressing part of this to me, that I think the more powerful you are, the worse you are at nation building. Because the more powerful you are, the more you think you can just get your way. And that's never how you do it. And so I think we fail not just because Vietnam is complex, but because we go into Vietnam and we think we're going to do it our way. And we're not going to talk to Ho Chi Minh because he's not going to do it our way. That would have been unthinkable for someone, I think, like Taft to be that dogmatic about that. And I think that's related to power. Maybe that's an advantage we have now, if the perception of our power in our own eyes is declining. David's question about people on the ground, this is something David and I have talked a lot about in David's dissertation, soon to be published. We'll answer part of this, and dissertation I hope to finish to get so I can read and grade. That's what you get for asking a question here, David. So the book does look at, to some extent, how people on the ground operate, but there's so much more work to be done, and this is not a deep social history in the way some of my work on the 60s was for a different period. It doesn't claim to do that. I couldn't have done that for all these cases. But I do make the point that on the ground you have very mixed reactions to the U.S. Very few cases where the United States is completely reviled, but very few cases where Americans are treated as the liberators they think they are. And that's part of what the process of nation building is. It's coalition building, as I see it. Ryan's question, which is a great one, about sort of the technocratic versus civilian or military elements of this. I mean, there's a lot that can be said about that, but I'll just make two very, very quick points. I think what never works is when one side tries to exclude the other, which is to say when you try to do it largely through military without civilian activities, or vice versa, civilian without military, and there are always tensions in that. And the most effective cases are where, in particular, the Secretary of War, later Secretary of Defense, is willing to work closely with the civilian entities. And I think the distinction between Rumsfeld and Gates is actually not unique to that pairing. And I think that's a very important part of this process. And then the second point I'll make is that there has to be, from the very beginning, there has to be a clear recognition that one is not simply going in to get the bad guys, but to actually change the population and work with the population. So the population-centered approach, I think, is crucial. Now, I think that sounds like a lot of John Nagel stuff. I don't want to fully embrace that, but I think he's on to something there. And then Tatiana, on American voters. What can we say about American voters? I think about this a lot. Going from Wisconsin to Texas, I very often say, how do these people get elected? And I look at the governors in both states, I have to say, and that's not even an anti-Republican comment. It's just my perception of some of these people. My perception, personal opinion, not the opinion of the Wilson Center. But I think one thing that we can say about American voters is that they have a time horizon that is different from the time horizon for international change. And that's a real challenge. This comes back to a point that John made when John was justifying dishonesty. right? That politicians can't be can't be honest about these things. But I think that's the real problem, and I don't have a simple solution to that. But I don't think American voters think in the way that we've been talking here, nor should they necessarily. And that's the challenge of leadership, and it's a very big challenge in American politics. I'm sorry, John.
John was not justifying dishonesty. John was trying to explain the temptation of dishonesty.
Very good. On that note, let's give a round of applause for our panelists. Congratulations on the book, Jeremy, an important book. I hope it will gender a lot of debate. I hope we started that debate or contributed to that debate today.
Absolutely.
John, thank you for very, very thoughtful comments. Thank you all for coming. There's a small reception outside, so please join us, and I'm sure Jeremy would be delighted to sign copies. Thank you.